Gary Dean lived with his wife at Moor End Houses at Silkstone Common near Barnsley in South Yorkshire, England. In 2018, Gary was 48-year-old. He was on the autistic spectrum and he could on occasion be a very difficult man. His wife was the head teacher at a local primary school, but Gary himself didn't work. Instead, he spent his days obsessively pursuing his hobbies. He was a very focused person and he had several obsessive traits. It's said that he was very obsessive about diesel trains. However, he was also unable to tolerate loud noises. Gary Dean enjoyed running and cycling, to the extent that it's reported that he was a marathon runner. He was also a proud member of the Penistone Footpath Runners. There'd been times in Gary's life where he'd behaved in a way that people perceived him to be abnormal or antisocial, maybe even insensitive or annoying. But with all that being said, it was often the case that once people understood the root cause of his behaviour, they were understanding, if not more tolerant. Gary's friends said Gary had difficulty at regulating his emotions, particularly connected to loud noises. But in all, the most important thing we need to know about Gary Dean is the fact that he was never overly aggressive, and he would only ever enter confrontation if he knew that he could safely retreat. That's all we really need to know about Gary's life. However, before we get into the case, we do need to introduce Scott and Carol Dawson. And this would be a great time to do the disclaimers. As always, this is a true crime case. That means it's a real story, involving real people, and then real people have real families. So although I do want you to comment, and I do want you to share, please do so with sensitivity. More often than not in a true crime case, when someone's introduced, like Scott and Carol Dawson, you assume that they're a married couple. But in this case, that's not true. Scott's 40-year-old, and Carol Dawson is his 71-year-old mom. They had a really close mother and son connection. One of them, both of them, honestly I don't really know, but they inherited some money. And with that money, they bought £300,000 worth of land in Silkstone Common. However, they didn't use this land to farm on. Instead, they rented it out to a farmer. Now, hold up a minute, because while I was looking at my last source, that said that Scott did actually do some farming of pigs on the land in a barn. So I think it was a bit of both. He kept a little bit of the land to himself to start his pig farming business. But other than that, it was let out to a farmer. Anyway, as you've probably noticed, Silkstone Common, where this land is where Mr. and Mrs. Dean lived. And this land isn't just in the same village, it's right next door to their house. For those on the podcast, you won't be able to see the image that I'm showing right now, but there's a row of terrace where the Deans live, and at the side of them, there is a walking trail. And it's just at the other side of this walking trail where the land is. Carol and Scott didn't live as close as the Deans though. Carol lived 9 miles away, and Scott lived 7 miles away. But that's not the only information about the farm location though. There's lots of woodland around this farmland that if you watch on YouTube you'll be able to see. And the track that I've just mentioned between the farmland and the Dean's house is actually the Trans-Pennine Trail. For those of you that don't know what that is, the Trans-Pennine Trail is a route for walkers, cyclists and horse riders. In its entirety, it spans the width of England, going from coast to coast with an impressive 215-mile trek. If you include the branches off the trail, it's actually 370 miles worth of track. Anyway, back to the farmland. Another important feature of this farmland is there's a public right-of-way across the middle of this farmland, across the middle of the field. Now, I'll not get into the ins and outs of what a public right-of-way is. It's quite obvious by the name. Now, I have looked at this quite a bit, and you can see the path across the field from a Google Maps picture. It's quite clear to see that there is a path that people walk across on this field. But then I went onto Google Maps Street View at the side of the field that goes onto a road, and nowhere can I see the access point or exit point. Regardless of that, this is a public right-of-way. It's a path that the public are allowed to use despite the fact that it being right through their farmland. Gary Dean quite liked to use these forest areas around the farm, and he also liked to run across the field on the public right-of-way during his morning run that he did every single morning. But with all this information I've just given you, you can probably guess Scott and Carol really didn't like him. They especially didn't like him or anybody else for that matter, using their land. Scott often reacted quite badly to people going across the path, but more so if they strayed off a path even slightly. There'd been an incident in which Scott lost his temper and revealed his attitude and threatening manner when a woman was walking a dog across a path and the dog strayed off the beaten path. But it really doesn't matter how much Carol and Scott disliked Gary using their field. He had a right to use it, and throughout 2016 and 2017, that's exactly what he did. And obviously, the more he used it, the more it aggravated Scott and Carol. It didn't take long before they created this full-on vendetta against him. And honestly, I think their behaviour was outright childish. At least while I wrote this part I did. Between them, they pushed unpleasant rumours about Gary, and they also directly tried to intimidate him. Now, when I say, they spread some nasty rumours about him, the first thing that comes to my brain, more often than not, is people are talking about you. So what? Sticks and stones and all that kind of malarkey. But rumours can be super damaging. And these rumours caused a lot of trouble, not just for Gary, but his wife as well, in so many different ways. One morning in late 2016, Gary's wife woke to find that a car and their house had been graffitied on. The graffiti said things like, "Stay away, Baz," that P word that ends in "do," and other offensive comments like that. Both Gary and his wife were often followed and threatened by complete strangers. They received threatening letters claiming that 8 men were going to sort Gary out. And it weren't just non-physical abuse either. 4 youths once broke into the home at night, and as they did, they shouted, "Where are you, you dirty bastard?" They eventually found the innocent couple and attacked them. 3 of the youths attacked Gary, while the other one attacked his wife, resulting in her having a broken nose. Now, bearing in mind with these accusations being thrown around, Gary's wife was a school teacher. And on another occasion, she went to school and found that they'd received a letter which claimed falsely that she shouldn't be allowed to work at the school or with children at all because her husband lured children into the woods. Of course, this caused many problems, but the local authority's safeguarding inquiry later found that there were nothing to support these allegations, they were completely baseless, and Gary had never been arrested or even in trouble for anything like that. While Scott and Carol are peddling these rumours, they're also constantly on the phone to the police, reporting issues to them. These calls to the police were more often than not made by Carol. However, you could pretty much always hear Scott in the background, angrily shouting and yelling. During one call to the police, Scott told the answering police officer that he would rip Gary Dean in fucking half because of the police's failure to act on reports. One of them also said, "Now if he's going to keep getting away with this, we all may as well do it to him." In that conversation, Carol said, "We won't keep standing for it. The police have never been there for us, and he's doing what he wants, causing damage to our land. It's just not good enough." In another call, Carol talked about how annoyed Scott was, and she said, "Somebody's going to be getting killed here." However, there was very little that the police could actually do. Gary wasn't really doing anything wrong. I mean, trespass is a civil offence, but he weren't even trespassing because it were public right away. But regardless of the laws, the lack of action from the police weren't enough for Scott and Carol. So they kept phoning, they kept pushing and pushing for something to be done against Gary, who, let's face it, still isn't actually doing anything wrong. And let's face it, a lot has already been done to Gary and his wife. And then eventually the police commenced a prosecution against Gary. But that failed, and Gary were acquitted, because he wasn't doing anything wrong. They were making quite a few claims against Gary. They were saying he was damaging the property, they were putting scarecrows on the land, he was defecating in the woods, and other such claims. And they did eventually manage to get a restraining order against him. After that, the situation calmed down a bit following the magistrate's court in 2018. But it was in that summer, the summer of 2018, that Scott and Carol decided that the law were failing them, so they must take it into their own hands. Scott and Carol were still being irrationally irritated by Gary's presence, and the vendetta against him had almost entirely been utterly useless. It had been completely ineffective from stopping him going on their land. It turns out in May 2018, and this is something that the prosecution and the newspapers put forward as if it'd done it just before, but obviously May is 4 months before September, Anyway, May 2018, Gary bought an air rifle. He claimed this air rifle was for shooting pigeons, and it's believed that this air rifle was stored at Carol's house. Now, I've touched on this lightly before, so let's just do it again. In England, not the UK, Scotland's different, the law is such that you can own an air rifle up to the power of 12 foot-pound without having a licence. Anything more than 12 foot-pound, you need to have a licence for. Now, that's important because nowhere throughout this have I seen the mention of a licence, so I'm fairly confident that this gun was lower than that limit. And although an air rifle under that limit would hurt a lot if you got hit by it, especially the closer it is, it's also not strong enough to kill a man. At least it's not typically strong enough. I'm not saying it's impossible, but as a rule of thumb, it's not going to be that effective. So back to it. Scott and Carol did their reconnaissance. They found out the details of Gary's wife's work patterns, and they also found out the school term dates. There'd been an internet search by Scott Dawson 3 days before the murder as to what the opening times were at the local school, and they had a photograph of Gary Dean inside of Scott's house, which is very strange. Why would you have a photograph of somebody you don't like in your house? Suppose that could help peddle the rumours. With the reconnaissance done, they made a plan to kill Gary Dean, with the use of the air rifle and other weapons, including a metal pole. On the 5th of September 2018, Gary started a fire in the forested area adjacent to the land. And alright, it's not their land, but this was the last straw for Carol and Scott. They needed Gary gone for good. So the next morning, Carol laid in wait and reported back to Scott when Gary's wife had left for work. And Gary's wife actually saw Carol's car in the lay-by on Housecar Road as she drove past. Knowing that Gary had a ritualistic habit of going for a run every morning before he had his breakfast, Scott and Carol then laid in wait for him to arrive near their farm. Scott was armed with his air rifle and a metal pole. And between 10 to 7 that morning and 20 past 7 that morning, Gary appeared, and it was Scott Dawson that shot Gary in the back. But as I said, this isn't a gun that's going to cause a fatal injury. But that didn't matter, because Scott then continued to attack him. He hit him with a pole and rocks and branches. It was hitting him on the head and on the body. But Gary did manage to escape into an adjacent culvert. While bleeding and terrified, he managed to crawl along it, trying desperately to get away. Now, instead of just leaving him, thinking, that's it, I've made my message very clear for him to stay away, because the signs hadn't, but now I've caused some damage, he's going to get the message. They didn't do that. Scott went after him into a forest and then continued to attack him. I can't be fully sure what role Carol played physically, how much she actually helped in the attack. It was definitely Scott that had the lead role in the attack. However, Carol then took the lead role in getting rid of the evidence. At 1 PM, Gary's wife attempted to phone him, but he didn't answer and she weren't getting a reply. She tried several more times that afternoon, but she still couldn't get hold of him. His phone were switched on, and it were ringing, and also the volume was on full, and this is how Gary was found. At 5:30 that evening, nearly 10 hours after he'd been attacked, a member of the public that were out for a walk heard Gary's phone ringing, and subsequently found his body. His body was in a Housecar dike. And it's claimed that Scott and Carol did intend to use a digger to dispose of his body. But obviously, this walker found him before they had a chance to do so. And again, this is something I find a bit strange about this case. It's been about 10 hours from him being killed to this walker finding him. Now, maybe they didn't have a digger available, maybe they didn't own a digger. But I'm fairly sure I wouldn't have waited 10 hours to get rid of the biggest bit of evidence. From the dirt on Gary's hands and on his knees, it was very clear that he tried to escape by crawling along the ditch. In addition to being shot in the back with the air rifle, which left a pellet lodged into his back between his 2 vertebrae, he suffered skull and rib fractures, severe bleeding and brain hemorrhaging. And of course, when Scott and Carol were interviewed by the police, they just told lie after lie. But their attempts to get away with the murder were completely fruitless, and the police did manage to gather enough evidence to convict them both. The court case started in Sheffield Crown Court on the 8th of July 2019, and it lasted for about 5 weeks. During those 5 weeks, neither Scott or Carol gave evidence. The judge referred back to this in his sentencing statements, saying that he believed that if he had, the true nature of their characters would have come out and been more exposed. Apparently, during the trial, every single call that Scott and Carol had made to the police had been replayed back to court. Scott and Carol's defence claimed that Gary defecated on the paths on their land. He started fires. He placed barbed wire at the height of horse riders. And he put scarecrows in their field without permission. Now, interestingly enough, Gary's wife did confirm that he put scarecrows in their field. She said he used to place scarecrows in the Dawson's land, but never meant any harm by it. But I remember thinking that was a massive leap, going from something so trivial to the revenge attacks. Now, up to this point, I was thinking what you're probably thinking. Gary's this innocent guy. He's a lovely guy. He's got a few problems, but he's a nice guy. They're just really protective over the land, and they're a bit extreme. Now, that's what I thought. I'd read tons and tons of news articles about this. I read the judge's sentencing statements. And then the very last thing I was looking for was another court document. And I read the application of appeal document. And that portrayed this entire thing in a different light. In that it claimed that Gary was putting these scarecrows out to scare horses that rode through the woodland, because he'd always objected to them using the woodland paths. And it also claimed that he did put twine at horse riders' heights to unseat the horse riders. It didn't say barbed wire though. As a result to Gary's activity, the Woodland Trust put up CCTV in the area, and they caught footage of Gary defecating in the woods. As a result of that, a police community support officer asked him to stop. So that, to me, threw everything that I already knew about this case into doubt. So then you have to question the allegations about the damage to their property. And in the application of appeal, it said the accusations of damaging property included breaking windows, interfering with machinery. He allegedly approached Carol with a hammer and threatened to burn down Scott's barn containing the pigs. Now, this isn't from a newspaper article. This is what's in the appeal documents, the application of appeal documents. So we have to take that with as much credibility as we took the judge's sentencing. We'll get to the appeal in just a second. Let's first do the actual sentencing. On Monday, the 12th of August 2019, at Sheffield Crown Court, the judge sentenced both Scott and Carol to life in prison. Before we look at the minimum terms, we'll have a quick look at a few things that the judge said. One of the things that stood out to me is regarding the taking of Gary to court and getting the 3-year restraining order. The judge said that he didn't think that should have ever gone to court to start with, and he didn't think the restraining order was rightly issued. He also said, "I have little doubt you both encouraged the other to act. The venom within your characters permeated the other to make a truly toxic and dangerous situation. You both fed off the venom within each other. The toxic admixture led to murder." So the minimum starting point was 30 years. That's for both of them. Then there was the aggravating factors. That was that they both intended to kill Gary. The use of a firearm. The revengeful motive. The fact that Gary was vulnerable by way of his autism, which the judge said wasn't really a heavy factor, but it was a factor nonetheless. Planning and premeditation. Gary's mental and physical suffering during the brutal attack. And the cover-up afterwards, which included cleaning and destroying key evidence. The mitigating factors for them both were separate. For Scott, the judge recognised that there were lots of irritation in the build-up to the murder, and the fact that he had no previous convictions. For Carol, her defence actually asked for the starting point to be 15 years, but the judge rejected it, obviously. However, he did accept that Carol wasn't the actual killer. She didn't have any physical input in Gary's death. He also acknowledged her age, and that she had no previous convictions. With all that being said, Scott Dawson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 31 years. Carol Dawson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 26 years. Neither of them showed any reaction when there was read out the length of their sentences. With those sentences, if the pair live long enough, Scott will be 72 before he's eligible for parole, and Carol will be 98. They did both win the right to appeal though, as I've just mentioned, but this is where my investigation into this case got really hard. I found two sources that both mentioned that Carol's sentence was reduced by 11 years. which would make her minimum sentence 15 years. But honestly, I couldn't find anything after the renewed application for leave to appeal document. I could find that, I read through that, but that isn't in itself the appeal. So the reason this discount were applied, I don't know. To be honest, I do think the 26 years for murder is a long sentence when you didn't actually commit the murder. And like I said, I could speculate through the application for leave appeal, but we don't do speculation here, so I'm just going to leave it at the fact that she was sentenced to 26 years, and apparently she got that reduced for 11. I do find it very strange that I can't find any credible documentation for that appeal, or that the media hadn't covered it. And that's all I've got for you. Now, something that came to mind when writing this was that nobody ever questions accusations made about people when they're a file of the P. You know the word I mean. And it brought me back to when I used to run a pub. And I can remember all the locals. It was a very friendly pub. Everyone was nice to each other. But a guy that didn't come in all that often, but he did come in, he were a customer, there was an accusation one day that he was one of those. And he was going to prison for it. Now, nobody asked any questions about that. Everybody just outright believed it. I mean, don't get me wrong. They did say, oh, you wouldn't have thought it, would you? Or, oh, I can't believe that. But they did all believe it. Now, I'm sorry, but that is wrong. If somebody makes that sort of accusation, until you know that, at the very least, that they are going to be on trial. I mean, in an ideal world, before passing judgment, you'd wait till the trial's finished. But none of them knew that it was proven. For all they knew, it were just a rumour. And as this case shows, making such rumours, pushing such rumours, can be extremely damaging and extremely dangerous. So my only message about that is, if you get told information, just take it a bit skeptically. Don't outright believe everything you're told, because it does happen that these false allegations come about. And like I said, do not be the one that push the rumour, because even if you don't do anything to that person, the person you tell might do something to that person. And then if it turns out that person's innocent, well, personally, I think you should be arrested for peddling rumours, which then caused something to happen to an innocent person. I'm not saying just outright don't believe it, obviously tread with caution, but do not just outright believe everything, and don't spread it and don't act on it until you know for certain that what you've been told is true. Now, this has been a roller coaster of emotions. Like I said, at first I felt really sorry for Gary, and I was like, Carol and Scott are psychopaths, not literally. But like I said, when I've read the appeal and I've seen that, I obviously I don't know if the things that were said about Gary is true. Defecating of a woodland, yeah, that's obviously true because he was caught by no authority. But the other things, he didn't say that were on CCTV. The damage to property, so you never know. Obviously, even if he were doing such things, even if he were putting the scarecrow up to injure and affect horse riders, it's still not right to kill him, obviously. And with all that said, I really can't wait to hear what you guys think. Do you think Gary should have just stopped using it right away, even though he had the right to use it? Do you think there's a massive smear campaign against Gary to make him look less innocent, so that they get less time? Do you think this is both as bad as each other, and it's just got worse and worse, and it's reached its inevitable doomy end? Well, that's all I've got. All I'm saying is, I love you. Take care of yourself. Take care of those around you. And I'll see you next week. Bye.